Good. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Joke de Velde, and I'm Associate Professor of Multilingualism in Education at the Department of Teacher Education and School Research here at the University of Oslo. On behalf of the research group Cisco, it's a great pleasure for me to introduce our speaker, Professor Suresh Kanagaraja from Penn State University in the United States, who's going to talk to us about English as a Creole language. The Norwegian curriculum states that all students should experience that knowing multiple languages is a resource in school and in society. But what does it really mean to know a language? In traditional linguistics and language teaching, knowing a language as a native speaker is the goal. And those who are not able to achieve this high standard may feel incompetent language users, or may even be told by others that their language doesn't meet the standards. And in his work, Suresh brings a different perspective and asks what happens to our understanding of language and of language use when we think in more fluid and dynamic ways. And an important shift is to take an interest in and to acknowledge how people in fact use language, rather than to think of how they should be using that language in line with a predefined norm. And in his talk, we'll hear examples of how artists, young people, professionals use English in creative ways. And I think these examples are important when we want to think about more inclusive ways of understanding and working with language in the linguistically diverse schools of the future. Feel free to post your questions or comments either in English or in Norwegian in the chat during the talk, and I'll read and translate if necessary at the end of the session. Suresh, I give the floor to you.
Okay. Thank you, okay. Thanks for this invitation. I'm happy to be sharing my scholarship and thoughts with colleagues in Norway. Let me first share my screen and see that everything is working okay. So are you able to see my screen? Good. I'm sure a lot of you might have been shocked that I call English a Creole language, because the word Creole and the way we treat it in linguistics is always as a deficient form of communication. Michel de Graaf, who is a linguist from Haiti and knows a thing or two about Creole languages, coined this phrase Creol Exceptionalism a few years back. And here's the definition of what he meant by that. And what you can see is people always think of Creole as not kind of a language. It's an exception for a lot of reasons, as Michel de Graaf explains. First of all, as a type of language, it is considered to be considered to have reduced forms to make communication easy. So for example, it doesn't have all the verb inflections or pronouns. People might use just one pronoun, he, for everybody, for they and me and everybody. So in terms of form, it's considered a highly reduced form. Furthermore, in terms of development, it's considered something that's less developed, that it needs to grow up. As you all know, the traditional distinction between pidgins and Creoles is that when pidgin grows up and acquires native speakers, when people start using pidgin for family and relationships, then it becomes a Creole, a little more developed form. So there is this assumption that this language has to develop. Furthermore, the context in which Creole develops is steeped in inequality and colonization. So a lot of Creoles have been documented as evolving in colonial contexts, where a powerful Western European trader or administrator meets natives, within quotation marks, from less developed countries. So this inequality and power relationship also makes it appear that Creoles are deficient. And finally, de Graaf goes on to say, because of these reasons, Creole speaking people are not considered cognitively advanced. So therefore, also Creole is not included in education or as for political purposes as a national language. So in many countries, I will talk about Jamaica later. They do have pidgins and creoles, but they are considered suitable only for the home and for the street. But for school, they use Jamaican English, which is considered a more developed form, right? So Creole has always been considered as a deficient communication, so much so that even liberal and progressive linguists sometimes don't make space for Creoles. So I can quickly show you the example of world Englishes, and you're familiar with this model by the famous Professor Braj Kashru, who developed a more developed more acceptance for diverse varieties of English, including mine, Sri Lankan English, which would come in the outer circle. All the post-colonial countries, former British colonies that he describes in the second circle, outer circle, are supposed to have their own variety of English. But there are two problems with this model. One is Professor Kashru didn't make a space for pidgins and creoles in this model. They don't belong anywhere. So there is a lot of nativization, localization going on all over the world, but pidgins and creoles were not accepted as part of world Englishes. Secondly, even within the Englishes in the outer circle, like Indian English, Pakistani English, Nigerian English, or mine, Sri Lankan English, we have a lot of other Creole forms in our own country. So the type of English that Professor Kashru legitimized by calling them Indian English, Pakistani English, etc., were the types of English spoken by the educated people. And they had less mixing. They had more advanced grammatical structures. But in our own country, we have less educated people who use more creolized forms of English, meaning that they have more mixing. They have more reduced forms, less verb inflections, less pronouns. And they are considered non-standard Sri Lankan English or non-standard Indian English. Can you see the inequality even among the post-colonial communities? We don't make space for creolized forms of English because we think they are deficient and they are unequal. They are not suitable for education and other purposes. So my task in this talk is to take the argument all the way into the court of English, including native speaker varieties of English, all of English, and say English is a Creole language to begin with. The reason I'm doing it is to suggest that a lot of people think of English as a global language, the most advanced language. And I will show you a lot of people who have talked like that, starting from colonial periods, that English is the most advanced language that people should learn. But if I can show that even English is a form of creolized language, then we might move to developing a more accepting, egalitarian, inclusive understandings of all languages, not to treat some as more developed than others, some as more advanced than others, but all languages are Creole-like. So in fact, my argument is not about English only, but about all languages. All languages evolve like Creoles through mixing, through contact, through borrowing, through changes, through diversification. But it's just an ideology, language ideology, that makes certain languages appear more developed, acceptable, standard, pure, and other languages as impure, mixed, deficient. So that's my project here. And people who are in post-colonial studies might remember a book by Deepesh Chakrabarty, an Indian historian. It was titled Provincializing Europe. And what he meant by that is Europe is considered the gold standard for anything, for culture, for civilization, for knowledge. But if I can show even Europe is just like a province, like India, Sri Lanka, Nigeria, then we can have a more accepting, equal, diversified understanding of knowledge, cultures, etc. Or another way to put it is, we sometimes think of English as a global language and Creoles and Sri Lankan English and others as local languages. But if we can show English is also a local language that belongs to a particular community, a particular part of the world, and evolve through language contact, then we might move to a position of thinking of all languages as evolving in similar ways, having similar kinds of possibilities for representation and communication, and we can move on to a more inclusive understanding of linguistics. So I want to start with some brief moments in the history of English. Of course, in this talk, it's difficult to cover everything in the long history of English, but just some examples of how English has developed, and also some examples of how creolization is still continuing, before I move on to move to the subtitle of my talk, which I didn't give you earlier, but as I planned this talk, I thought I'll include it, which is to decolonize linguistics, which to say that the assumptions in English or other languages comes from certain colonial values and ideologies. But I want to conclude by introducing you to the notions of language in other parts of the world, including mine, from Sri Lanka, South Asia, where we think of languages as different, and we think of languages as acceptable even when they are mixed and diversified. And my question is, if you want to develop a more inclusive understanding of language, then maybe we should also learn from non-European ideologies of language. Okay, so a quick couple of examples about how English developed over time, and you probably know this history already, but way back, maybe in 400 BC, when English started developing in Britain, you all remember it didn't even start in England. It was formed by certain dialects coming from Europe, from even closer to your part of the world. So the dialects of Angles, Jutes, Saxons migrated to England. Why I'm emphasizing the word migrated is because people in the United States and UK often insult people like me when we have an accent and say, go back to where you came from. This is the land of the English people. You know, this is the land where English is spoken. But if you think about it, English didn't even belong to England. It started outside England and moved in the form of 3 or 4 dialects to England, and then got mixed with local languages like Gaelic, Irish, and very powerful languages that were already there, like Scandinavian. So English is steeped in creolization and mixing. Or when we move a little further down in history to like 9th century, there were many different kingdoms, at least 4. Wessex was gradually becoming the more dominant kingdom. But if I had more time, I would show you examples where the same text was written in different types of English in the different kingdoms. So the same text, they had it in 4 different forms. Or I have examples from travelers from Wessex going into Northumbria, and they were asking local people, they were hungry, they wanted eggs. And the local people said, we don't speak French, sorry. They didn't realize it was English, except that it was another type of English. So people lived with diverse Englishes in England at that time. Or move further down in history, 1066, Norman invasion. And at that time, the center of power was in Europe, the part that is coded in, that is colored by brown. And London became integrated into the center. And the language for government, diplomacy, politics, etc., was French. So English was considered a vernacular, not even a language. It was considered the language of the local people for informal purposes. People in England at the time had to be bilingual, you know, switching between French and English. And there would have been a lot of mixing. So much so that a scholar I know, a linguist, James Clyde Bailey, James Clive Bailey, I'm sorry. He wrote a paper some years back saying English is a dialect of French. It's not even a separate language. And he gave a lot of grammatical, syntactical examples to show that what we call English has acquired so much from French. You might think of it as a dialect of French. You also know that the words that are considered originally part of Old English, the time when it started, people say are monosyllabic, like 1, 2, 3, 4, hand, head, words like that, monosyllabic. So anything that is polysyllabic, more than one syllable, is French or from other languages. So if you look at it that way, only 5% of words they say are monosyllabic words from Old English, meaning that English is such a mixed language, borrowed from so many people. In fact, Oxford English Dictionary says English borrowed 3 words from Tamil already. I'll tell you later during Q&A if you want. We don't have time. So they borrowed from everybody, including from my small community in South Asia. So one other historical point to keep in mind also, in the US, we have a lot of debates about where did Black English come from? Did it come from straight from Africa, or did it evolve in the plantations where the slaves started working? People also talk about where did American English develop? Did it develop from Boston? I'm sorry, from England, straight from the British dialects that were spoken and came to Boston and New England? Or did it have a local development? One thing that is forgotten is that there was an English that developed in the sea, not in anybody's land, not in Africa, not in England, not in the US. So that's where you have in this map, it's called this triadic, it's called triangular trade, meaning that you can see that 3 points from England and Europe, certain things go to West Africa. They take these things, get slaves from there, take the slaves to plantations in the Caribbeans and east of United States, and then they take sugar, tobacco, etc. to England. But during the process of this trade, there was a Creole English that developed that was spoken by slave traders, slaves, commercial people, sailors from many countries. Portugal, actually it's said that Portugal had already started this trade long before the British. So the lingua franca that was spoken in the sea was more heavily influenced by Portuguese rather than English. But that's the English also that came to the eastern side of the United States and was spoken widely. But eventually, what has happened is an ideological work to the point that a lot of these creolizations, I won't say died, but got ignored, misrecognized. We don't talk about this creolization anymore because in England, it took about 300, 400 years of the sociolinguist Asif Agha calls it enregisterment. That is, how do you develop values, associations for a particular variety of English as the valued language, as the standard language, the pure language? And he said it took about 300, 400 years from about 12th century all the way to later when they developed the London, the southeastern British variety of English as the norm, as the standard. So it's a purely ideological work that included dictionaries, handbooks, newspaper articles to say this variety is the best, right? And same thing happened in the United States. People talk about Daniel Webster, the dictionary maker, who first constructed the dictionary for American English in order to drive home the point that American English is an English of its own. These are the acceptable words, and this is as valued as British English. It took a lot of work. So there's an ideological work that was involved in making people look at all these creolized varieties of English as standard, pure, norms. And of course, in both in the United States and in England, all this was also connected to nation state formation. In order for people to think of USA as an independent, separate country, Daniel Webster was very clear in his dictionary. He wanted American English to be treated as a language of the American people and as prestigious as any other English. And same thing in England, where people developed a notion of English as equal to French or even better than French over time. So I want to cut through all those developments to come to this point, which is colonization, in which English really became not just a national language, but a global language. And you can see the ideological work continuing here. And these are the statements of one Thomas Macaulay. He was an educational officer in India. And he wrote this report to London in 1835 to argue that English should be made the medium of education in India, and of course, Sri Lanka was the neighboring country in all these countries. I'll just let you read the argument. It's humorous because, the local languages, he's comparing it to Arabic and Sanskrit, and he doesn't refer to them in these quotations, but in the rest of the document, he compares those, and he says, they don't have anything compared to English. And if you think about it, Arabic and Sanskrit were much more ancient languages. There are a lot more things in their languages available. But I want you to focus on the third quotation because it refers to creolization. And but creolization in a different direction. He says, basically, we want to teach English because we want to form a separate class of interpreters who will serve between us, the rulers, and the local people. And these people will be a class of persons, Indian in blood and color, but English in taste, in opinions, and in intellect. That's creolization. That's creolized identity, right? This is happening to people. We are being made mixed people. But go further down, to that class, we may leave it to refine the vernacular dialects of the country, to enrich those dialects with terms of science borrowed from the Western nomenclature. So what he's saying is, these people will change their language, like Tamil, Hindi, etc. But he's not thinking that English will become creolized, right? He's thinking that we will learn English and then change our languages. Our languages would become mixed and transferred. Surprise, surprise, English got changed. So, but you find this even when the British was still there. This is an Indian novelist, Raja Rao, and this novel was written in 1938 before Britain gave independence to India in 1947. So the British were still there, and what Macaulay thought would happen is happening in reverse. That is, English is getting creolized, because what Raja Rao says is, in order to write this novel, I have to change English. I have to make English Indian. And in order to do it, I have to do it creatively. He says, one is to convey in a language that is not one's own, the spirit that's one's own. We cannot write like English. We should not. We can write only as Indians. And if you read the novel, you'll find that from beginning to end, it's in Indian English. It's a fascinating novel. It's still widely available. Kantapura is the name of a town, rather a village. And what this novel is about is it's narrated through the words and eyes of a grandmother in this village, less educated. But what she's doing is she's giving all the villagers information, stories about what Mahatma Gandhi is doing in the rest of the country for independence. But since the authorial vehicle, the narrator here, is an elderly grandmother, Raja Rao creates English that is suitable for her, which is an Indian English. So it's a nice narrative technique to make a justification for Indian English. It's not Raja Rao writing as an educated person. It's the grandmother writing through her story. So the Indian English started all the way right when the British was still there. And then here are a few more examples of what happened in Africa. These are African writers you might be familiar with, who also started saying we should write like Africans. who can express our values and our thoughts in a language in English that is suitable for us. HB assumes it'll happen automatically. You really can't help it. When I start writing in English, it will carry the weight of my African experience, and therefore it'll be a new English in its own words. Ngugi is a little suspicious because he doesn't want to dabble with English, but he wants to make a space for other languages also. But Okara is the person I really like because he says, I have to consciously engage with English in experimentation and creativity to make it a different kind of language. And he uses a word from chemistry. He says, yeah, in the second part of the quotation, if therefore an African wishes to use English as an effective medium of literary expression, he has to emulsify it with the patterns, modes, and idioms of African speech. Emulsify, I think, is come from chemistry of how this mixing has to take place, and all the writers engage in it. I'll just give you one small example. Of course, all these are novelists, so I have to give you pages and pages to illustrate the way they wrote. So I'll choose from another part of the world, the Caribbean, you know, the Nobel Prize winner, Derek Walcott. And I like this poem, just a beginning of this poem, because Derek Walcott is not just changing, creolizing English for his purpose, his voice. In this case, it's actually to give voice for one of his friends who is Indian, from India. So as you know, in the Caribbean, they have Blacks from Africa, they have Indians from India, and so many other countries who live there. And this poem is the sense of alienation of one of his friends who is from India, who feels far away from his land. And this poem is about how he's, every evening, he goes to a quiet part in the Caribbean, and he engages in a kind of a meditation where it's not only spiritual, it's also social, because what he does is, he says his soul travels to India and comes back. This is the only way he can maintain cultural contact with his own home. But what you wouldn't realize is that Walcott makes some subtle changes in his English to make it more Indian. So the parts I have highlighted in red are actually grammatical violations, but it's done in such a subtle way you wouldn't see it. When sunset, a brass gong vibrate, so you know that sunset is singular, it has to be vibrates through Kua. Kua is the name of their town. Grammatically, you would say, it is then I see my soul. But he says, it's then I see my soul. And if you read loud, it's almost like how we in South Asia talk. Kashru calls it a sing-song effect in English. So when sunset, a brass gong vibrate through Kua, is then I see my soul, swiftly unsheathed. So he's doing some slight modifications to the English to make it suitable for an Indian. And these are examples you would find in a lot of literature. And one of the things to realize is this: we talk about diversification in education, linguistics, etc., but it first happened in literature, long before anybody started talking about world Englishes or diversity or lingua franca. All these writers who were writing all the way from 1938 made a lot of advances in shaping an English that was more diverse, suitable for the other identities of people all over the world. But the story continues. I'm going to jump again in time from post-colonial, from colonization, post-colonialism now to globalization. And we think of globalization as after independence, but in the hands of technology and mobility and other developments in travel, where there is greater contact between people. We even use the word transnationalism, where people are connecting with people outside their own countries all the time for education, work, and communication like this. So, and there we have even greater creolization that goes beyond just the post-colonial countries, between just the local and the Western, but in multiple directions. So this is a commercial signage, and I'll show you, this is part of the whole area called linguistic landscapes. But a particular variety of linguistics landscapes is street signage relating to commercial purposes for advertisements, shopping, sales. So this I found in New York when I was working in New York City. I was traveling home one day after work, and this was in a huge billboard. And this is by Continental Airlines. It's not functioning anymore. It was bought by United Airlines, but they had just started a new service to Buenos Aires in Argentina, and they had a brand new sign saying you can buy tickets now. But there was something funny about this advertisement, because it looked like it was in English. At the bottom, you see non-stop flights every week. It's in English, but then the sign itself is C is not English. So it looked like it's in Spanish. But then I thought, if it is Spanish, after C, they should have a apostrophe or a comma to say, yes, we do travel to Buenos Aires, but they're not doing that. So I said, why is it a grammatical problem or something else? So then I read the whole sentence together, see Buenos Aires, see Buenos Aires. If you look at it that way, it's a multilingual pun. They're having it both ways. They are saying, yes, we travel to Buenos Aires in Spanish, but also see as in S-W-E, go and see Buenos Aires in English, right? So, but what's fascinating is this. This was in a very prominent place in New York City outside the Lincoln Tunnel, where people, millions of people or thousands of people commute in and out for work. And the Continental Airlines is assuming that people can make sense of this multilingual pun from whatever country they come from, because not everybody is going to be a Spanish-speaking person who commutes there. There are people like me, immigrants from all over the world. But what they're assuming is people do have the capacity to unpack this mixed phrase and get the meaning. And you must imagine, they spent, I'm sure, thousands of dollars to get this spot. And they got this spot only for this 3-letter multilingual pun. They know it works. They know people will understand. If they don't understand, it's a waste of money. But they know that's not the world we live in. Creolization is acceptable. It's normal. It makes money. So one more example. This is a sign that's always found in Korea. And you wouldn't know it directly, but you will find it in like shopping places. Somebody is also now wearing it on a t-shirt. And this involves a kind of a very complex linguistic operation in order to decode this creolized expression. So 5 in Korean language is O. Now you get it, right? So actually, you should be reading it as, oh my God, it's just $1. It's only $5. Oh my God. So, but in order to unpack this hybrid expression, you have to first work with the visual, the number 5. You have to read the sign, the 5, translate it into Korean, O, then translate it one more time, the O into English. I'm using translate in a wrong way. Just sound it out. You don't even translate the meaning. You just sound it out. Oh my God. So there are 3 operations taking place. First, decode the visual into Korean, then utter it out loud in English in order to get the meaning. So there is some bit of multimodality, which is also part of this sign. So I want to include in creolization, not just the mixing of different languages, but also different symbol systems like numbers, visuals, and how they also shape meaning. We have ignored them in the past. So I want to quickly play a rap by this artist. I'm not sure if you're familiar with MIA. She's the actual Tamil name is Madangi Arul Pragasam, which is a Tamil name. She's from my town in Sri Lanka, but they're all exiles in London. And she won an Emmy some years back for a song. And she also performed with Madonna in one very interesting case in the United States. It was very controversial. They kissed. So, and she made a sign that became, she thought it's just art, but in America, we are very purist. We don't want all those bad finger signs. So she got in trouble. But she mixes a lot of words. and she writes and performs from London. And she borrows a lot of words from a lot of other immigrant communities in London. And so her songs appeal to a lot of different people beyond the Tamil community. And I think the reason she's doing it, not only to reflect her identity, she's a person from inner city London, so to speak, from the urban context there, but she's also Tamil, and she's a spokesperson for the Tamil cause, the ethnic conflict in our country. So she's making new connections. So I just highlighted in the next slide some words she is borrowing from other cultures and other communities. So Guan, I did some research online, you can do this also, is from Guyanese Creole, which is like, what's going on? What's going on? And Galang is a Jamaican Creole for put your head up, go on. You might translate it as keep going, keep moving, don't worry about the violence. Actually, the song is about the violence in London and the violence in Sri Lanka. So what she's saying is in this context, she's saying, let's go on. Langa langa is a British Cockney expression for drugs. So actually the song says, it's a bad story. I don't hope nobody will take this to heart. Just take drugs and keep your life going, ignore the pain and suffering, put yourself in a good mood, right? So that's what the song is saying. But then you find two phrases I've highlighted: shotgun get you down, too late you down. The verb is missing. Shotgun will get you down, or something like that, or shotgun gets you down, might get you down, too late you are down. So people call this Black stylized English, meaning, she probably doesn't, well, she might be a little more familiar with Black English, but people all over the world who perform rap adopt a kind of English which is not exactly Black English, but sounds like Black English. It's kind of almost a parody, but there's the assumption that in rap you have to sound like a Black person in order for the rap to be legitimate. So what she's doing here is just removing the verb, because we know in African American English they would say like he eating, he running, he reading. They take the helping verb out. So she's doing something like that. So that might be Black English. So you find like about 4 different varieties of English in addition to just standardized English, like London calling, speak the slang now. What you might miss is that in the actual performance, in the music TV, in the background, she also has Tamil. So I'll just quickly play a few lines for you, and you will see in the background, she has written in Tamil in the screen, Appadi. Appadi mean what's going on, which is, which comes in other dialects in the song. And then you find 2 kinds of contrasting images. Certain images belong to inner city London, like yellow cabs and high rises, which we don't have in Sri Lanka. And on the other hand, you have images from Sri Lanka, which is palmyra trees, but also some political symbols like a tiger. Our resistance group in Sri Lanka was called the Tamil Tigers. And then you also find tanks, grenades, jets bombing, which are all part of the reality in Sri Lanka that I come from. So a quick read, because I want to see how all these things make up this rap. And then more importantly, if you read below the YouTube, which we won't have time now, people from many different languages and cultures are able to make sense of this, because they are responding to the whole performance. The visual, the body movement, the images, and therefore the mixing doesn't become a problem for anybody. Although, that's why we fear mixing. That's why we like pure standardized forms of language. We say that is more intelligible. That makes us share communication more efficiently. But mixing can do that too. And that's what's happening if you put all these things together. So let me quickly play you that. Okay, that's Tamil.
London calling, speak the slang now. Boy say what? One girl say what? What? London calling, speak the slang now. Boy say what? One girl say what? What slam? Galang galang galang. Gala 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 lang galang galang. Get down, get down, get down, get down. Get down, get down, get down. Too late, you down. Dun 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 dun. Dun 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 dun. Lang 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 lang. Lang 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 lang. Lang 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 lang. Lang 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 lang. Who the hell is hunting you in the BMW? How the hell they find you? 147 jet sets gonna get you. Pull the strings on the hook. One paranoid you raising a foot of it. Who the hell is hunting you in the BMW?
The high rises,
how the hell they find you?
London,
147 jet sets gonna get you. Pull the strings on the hook. One paranoid you raising a foot of it.
So I'll develop that argument in a minute about why it's important to put all these things together. When you start back on a screen on play mode, it freezes. I think you have noticed that, right? So I'll have to start all over again. So I want to quickly move to this irony that creolization or hybridity, nobody uses the word creolization because we're embarrassed about it. We call all this hybridity or code mixing or code switching, but it could as well be creolization. They're accepted in social media, in rap, in linguistic landscapes, street signage, commercial signage. People actually making money. MIA is winning awards, and she overnight became a millionaire, right? But we are not prepared to accept it in academic discourses, in schools, academic writing, etc. But some people are using it in their academic writing as well. And this is a page from an African-American scholar, Geneva Smitherman. She's actually a sociolinguist, so recently retired from Detroit, Wayne State University. And she's done a lot in her publications to talk about accepting Black English as legitimate and necessary for Black students, even to make a transition from Black English to Standard English. And she also brought a new, worked with others to propose a new resolution in the US educational system. It's called Students' Right to Their Own Language. And that's what's being alluded to in this page. So this essay she is looking about 50 years after this resolution, which came in 1972. I wish I had time to show you the resolution. It was just like a small paragraph which says, you cannot say disparaging things about the dialects your students bring to your class because they are necessary for their identity. It's part of their community. You have to accept them and work from them. People understand it different ways. I guess some people just don't say bad things about the dialects, but they don't include that in their pedagogy. So in that sense, it's still falling short of their expectations. But what's happening here is Geneva Smitherman is trying to use the Black English in our own writing, in academic writing. So this is actually from a publication. A lot of people would say academic publications are norm governed, they are heavily edited, therefore you have to use only privileged varieties of English or standard varieties of English. But here what she's doing is she's using certain phrases. I've underlined them, circled them in red because they are not standard English. They actually come from different types of Black English. Some from Southern varieties of Black English. Some people use the word street speech, which is from urban Northern contexts, like big cities like New York, Detroit. So in the first statement, she says, when she brought this proposal, some people were not very happy. They asked her, CCC is the name of this organization, College Composition and Communication, where she was bringing this proposal. This organization handles the teaching of writing all over the US. And in this organization, she brought this resolution, students' right to their own language. And she says, when we proposed this, some people came and asked us, CCC had lost their cotton picking mind, meaning that you've gone crazy. But this is a phrase, expression that is used in the South among slaves. You were picking cotton. So she uses that to show how people insulted her. And then the next paragraph, there are people who supported this. They want to say nice things to her. So they said, they asked, why it took you all so long? You should have talked about the acceptability of English a long time ago. So, but this expression, why it took you all so long, y'all, we all use it now. But if you think about it, it's considered informal because it's actually you all. Same thing in the bottom, whole another level. She's not saying a whole, you could say another level, but she's saying whole another level. It's maybe to exaggerate the distinction even more. There's also an informal expression used in urban context. So she's mixing a lot of different varieties of Black English in a publication. And a lot of people are unsure whether students can do that in classrooms to negotiate or resolve their personal identities and the academic discourse. But I'm finding it in classrooms also. So this is an example from a course I taught titled Teaching Second Language Writing. This is for teachers of second language writing. It includes undergraduates and master's level students. And one of the important activities in this course, pedagogical activity, I call it an autoethnography. That is, while we do readings on how to teach writing, and while we do actual teaching experiences, going to classrooms for model teaching, or we call it practicum, to get exercise in practice. They also write their own story about how they learned writing in some of them it's multiple languages. So this is an undergraduate student whom I'll call Butaina. This is a semester-long project. So this didn't happen right away, but happened much later, where she started using Arabic in her writing. I don't want to interpret the whole thing, but I'll give you some clues how we interpreted it. Now, I don't know Arabic, and majority of the students in the class didn't know Arabic. Some of them from American, there are others from China, Japan, etc. And what we did was we saw a pattern, and we also included not just the language, but the visuals, the whole ecology of this text. So what she uses in the top, this section divider, she consistently used throughout her essay to make distinction between different vignettes of a progression in literacy, how she became more and more proficient in English. So we assumed, okay, this is a new vignette, the safe assumption. And looks like the way the Arabic is arranged, it could be verse, it could be a poem, because there's a kind of a parallelism, 3 on one side, 3 on the other side. And looks like the 4th line might be the name of a poet. So we assumed if it's epigraph, and if the writer knows what they are doing, the epigraph is to say something about the narrative that comes below. It doesn't relate to the one that came above because there's a section divider. So these are common sense assumptions anybody would make. And I won't unpack all the meanings, but one of the things we assumed was maybe the poem talks about the value of hard work, because that's what she goes on to talk about, how she worked hard in order to gain membership in this English club. Also, you see, MashaAllah, she used very often. She doesn't transliterate it into Arabic. She uses it in English. But here's one of the really classic problems for Arabic writers. They can't use the word Muhammad or use certain other expressions. So, for example, if you use the word Muhammad, you have to say also, peace be upon his name. If you don't say that, it's sacrilege. So, but in English, if somebody says that in their writing, we would say that's unidiomatic. You shouldn't do that. But they can't help but do it. So you can see there are certain cultural needs that are very critical. You really can't violate it. But these students might be caught up in a dilemma here. In English, it's going to sound very unusual every time I say peace be upon his name. But on the other hand, how can I say it? I can't use the word Muhammad without saying that. So same thing with MashaAllah, thanks be to God. And she keeps on using it. So we'll come back to this later. But the reason why a lot of people don't accept this in academic English is we still, all of us want norms. We all want pure, standardized languages that we assume everybody can understand. We feel that these deviations, mixings are unintelligible. So going back to, I just want to revisit some models of English we have, efforts to diversify English, where we don't want to accept those kinds of mixings. Even when we accept the diversification of English, we still look to certain norms as the touchstone for communication. We all have to work around these norms. So in this case, one more thing to think about is the inner circle was called norm providing in Khashru's formulation. So expanding circle, like your country, Norway, was called norm dependent, because he thought, Khashru thought, these countries didn't have a British colonization, therefore they don't have English as a second language in their own countries. They're using English for contact purposes as a foreign language. Therefore, they would borrow their norms from England or USA or Canada, the native speaker countries. But a lot of people even debate this three-part distinction, inner circle, outer circle, expanding circle, meaning that still native speaker norms are given a valuable place. But we have had some changes after that, where people have modeled the diversity of English in more inclusive ways. One good thing you can see now is that some forms of Creoles are also accepted in this model. So, not seeing, do you all see, I used to see that there was some, there are a lot of new mixtures that are, okay, you find Sierra Leone Creole on the bottom left side. I hope you see that. So it's called Sierra Leone Creole, right? So the people are now making space for those as well, and a lot of other mixed languages going beyond the nation state varieties that Khashru accepted. But still, in this case, David Kushal and Tom McArthur still assumed there would be a universal shared norm that will develop for all of us to communicate. So the argument that they made was, people can have their own varieties of English in their own context, but when you talk outside your community, you talk to other people outside your country or your culture, you would use the world standard English. And in this case, they thought of world standard English as a universal norm that would evolve when all the people start interacting together. It's in the future. It might actually remind you of another term that you might be more familiar with, lingua franca co. And this was while Tom McArthur and David Crystal were prophetic, they didn't study it, they were just thinking it'll happen in the future. These scholars should be given credit because they actually did corpus analysis to see what is common about multilinguals talking to each other. Of course, as you know, they have now abandoned that project and come closer to what I'm going to tell you is my position on this, which is they're not looking for a common grammar anymore, a universal shared norm anymore. So can we talk to each other in our own varieties of English without resorting to a common shared norm? That's the big question. And that's what all these models try to avoid, because they still thought, however diverse the English language is, however diverse communication is, we all have to have a shared norm in order to talk across cultures, to talk internationally. So I want to illustrate how we made, I already gave you some examples of how we made sense of this writing, you might call creolized writing, by working with the whole context, by looking at all the ecological resources. I'll give you some things that the students in the class said when they unpacked the meaning. I don't know, I won't have time to talk about all of them, just a few examples. But what I want to show is they're negotiating the language one-to-one, rather than saying, you have to talk like me. But you have to write in my English, or I'm not going to understand it. They are not saying that. They're trying to go beyond themselves to work with all the resources to make meaning. So Mike, in this case, he's a native English speaker, NES. He says, to me, the non-Arabic speaker, this quote is a beautiful collection of alien writing, fascinating but incomprehensible. But I think it's a move that distances me from Buthena, but also leaves me intrigued and interested in reading more. It's drawing me into a writing out of curiosity. And when he says it's fascinating, it's beautiful, he's saying something that this Korean student is also saying. The script is so beautiful, it's elegant. So you know what they're doing, right? They are not looking only for the literal meaning of the Arabic. They are also responding to the aesthetics, the beauty of it. So they're expanding the notion of meaning, they're expanding the notion of literacy to appreciate not just literal meanings, but all the additional meanings that come. Just one more example, Tim, further down, he says something can only be known to those who are willing to learn and become Arabic English bilinguals. And Christy, another native English speaker, says, I think she's quoting it because she's indirectly showing us, the reader, who she is through these poems. Perhaps it is up to us to figure out the significance of these words. What they're doing is, we might call it performative meanings. Even if you don't understand it, what the writer is saying is, I am different and I'm going to make you powerless. Part of the story here is that Buthena's essay was about how she felt powerless learning English because she was a non-native speaker. Now she's turning the tables and making the reader powerless because they can't engage with the Arabic. So the meaning here is a performative meaning, and Tim and Christy seem to get it. She's teaching us a lesson. We are made uncomfortable here, and we are made to engage with her otherness, with her diversity. So we are negotiating this whole text through multiple resources, multiple semiotic resources, the visuals, and the whole context. So that's what makes me think of something like this as a model that might help me and help all of us deal with creolized mixed forms of writing and speaking. Where for me, the center is not a shared grammar. The center is about practice. What can we do? Again, encapsulate this with something a person told me when I was interviewing them in their multilingual workplace. In this workplace, they have people from many different countries with many different varieties of English. And I asked them, how come your communication is successful? And this person's answer was very simple. He says, we don't look at what they are bringing, but how we can communicate. Or in other words, it's not about the what, it's about the how. The what is always going to be diverse. People will have different accents, different words, different mixings. But that's not the issue. It's taken for granted. They have to be different. But the main question is how? What am I going to do about it? And there are so many strategies we can talk about in sociolinguistics. So, but the final part of my talk, I want to explain to you why we moved away from that kind of argument, why we didn't take those things seriously. This is to go back to the European assumptions, modernist assumptions about language. There are three metaphors I want to highlight that has been part of modernist linguistics, starting from maybe 14th century, not just linguistics, in a lot of other disciplines. You might call the dominant frameworks, we have structuralist and cognitive, starting from Saussure, then moving on to Chomsky. One of the assumptions, as you can see here, is the idea that languages evolve, the languages grow, and they become, so the key ideological trope is time and progress. Language grows up in time and they progress. And the big trees here, like English, Spanish, have developed more. And there are so many languages that are lost and forgotten. So actually, Michel de Graaf, in another conference he spoke to, said, this has some eugenist assumptions. That is, it's about superiority of certain peoples. Or another way to put it is, this is Darwinian. This is about the survival of the fittest, the strongest. Certain languages and communities which are strong become powerful. Certain languages, communities which are not strong die. They are small. So, so that leads to a lot of assumptions like this. We talk about linguistic capital, language capital. Certain languages are more economically advantageous. Certain languages are local. They are not very useful for a lot of other purposes. So there is an assumption of hierarchies in languages. Certain languages are superior, certain languages are inferior. And this is also part of what is called the Creole continuum. I mentioned in the beginning, the assumption of progress, time, evolution also informs why we look down on Creole. Creole has to grow up. So this is in Jamaica. They use the word Basilec for lower forms of Creole, which are not accepted publicly or in schools or in state purposes. Higher forms of Creole, like Jamaican Standard, is the same expression in 4 different ways, right? 4 different ways of saying it. The Jamaican Standard is used in school, but Creole hasn't grown up. It has to grow up in order to be used. So the assumption of time, progress, development is there. I want to bring you to my own community. We don't have those assumptions in our understanding of language. And in South Asia, this first painting is just about how there was a lot of coexistence before colonization. There have a lot of languages, a lot of cultures lived side by side. And these are just 2 examples of creolized writing that we don't study anymore, forgotten after colonization. But recently we have discovered them. On the right-hand side, you know, I belong to the Tamil group, and there were Muslims who came from Java much later in history, around maybe the 9th century or so. And the Tamils were largely Hindu, and the Javanese people who are largely Muslim, they coexisted. And they developed a writing, a special writing, that is a mix of Arabic and Tamil for writing about Islamic things. So this is not fully Arabic, it's a mix of Tamil and Arabic. On the left-hand side is another form of writing, which is a mix of Sanskrit and a lot of regional languages like Tamil, Malayalam, etc. This is for basically, Sanskrit was the lingua franca in that area. Other languages like mine were considered vernaculars, but we mixed them to make it more acceptable for religious purposes for us. And Sanskrit didn't have any problem. So, and that continued. This is, when I was growing up, we had a lot of writing like this. And I have highlighted English. We didn't have a word for this writing. It was just a practice we took for granted. Now I might use some words for that, like code meshing or translingual. But when I was growing up, we didn't have words. We just moved in and out of those languages in all our writing and speech. So I want to quickly illustrate where this ideology comes from. And this is a book by an Indian sociolinguist who recently passed away. His name is Lakshman Gupchandani. And I call it spatial linguistics because it's not about time, it's about space. How in one place, everybody lives together. And and also it's not about community. You are from that community, you are from this community. It's about how different people share the same space in the same land. And therefore, languages become very mixed. So Gupchandani introduces his view of language as a theorization about language that coexists. He says it represents the study of mutual relations between organisms and their environments. So this is an ecological, maybe, view of language. Language coexist with its environment, drawing from everything in the environment, including the different communities. Then he goes on to say, because of this approach, languages mix very easily, and seemingly different languages have parallel forms of development, and he uses the word family. So because what he says is, from the point of view of Europe, languages might belong to different families. Like my Tamil is considered from the Dravidian language community, and the other language in my country, Sinhala, spoken by the Buddhists, is considered Indo-European language family. But actually, because we have started living here for a long time, they are very similar, far beyond their genetic making. You know, the genetics doesn't apply anymore. Actually, they are very similar. So Gupchandani actually draws a language map for South Asia, which is, he calls it like a rainbow. They are, depending on the place, one language fuses into the other. They are not binary. They are not hierarchical. They are not different. They appear fairly similar because of the mixing. And then he goes on to say, in the Indian subcontinent, languages are complementary all the time. We do mixing all the time. And it's not surprising, it's not strange. So you might say the creolization, or in India, in South Asia, there is creolization taking place instantaneously all the time. When two people meet each other, they are borrowing from each other, modifying their speech. They are not waiting for a Creole to grow up or a Creole to sediment into a grammar that is acceptable to everybody. It's happening all the time. How do we communicate? The final statement is about the practice. Kubchandani identifies two forms of practice. He calls one synergy and the other serendipity. Synergy is put your best effort in order to understand somebody. We call it willingness. If you have willingness to understand somebody, which is what we did in our classroom, you will understand because you will look at all the evidence in that page. Serendipity, accept the other in his or her own terms, and be prepared for unexpectedness. This is what I earlier mentioned from this interview participant who said, it's not about the what, it's about the how. Be prepared to accept unexpectedness. And he goes on to use a nice paradox. He says, in South Asia, be appropriate deviations as the norm in the lingua franca. Can you say it? Appropriating deviations as the norm. So what is the norm? Not shared grammar, not standard English, not an autonomous language. Deviation is the norm. And we expect that all the time. So that would make me talk about how we can move from certain assumptions that we have in current form of linguistics to what I might call a decolonial linguistics, that is a linguistics that is a little more inclusive and diversified, because we need to think about languages in different ways, cultures in different ways, where we assume languages that are mixed as a normal. We don't expect grammars ready-made, but be prepared to develop grammars on the spot with people, not worry about coming always with a competence, but to achieve meaning with people in social practice by engaging with other people. So I won't repeat all of them. We can talk about them during the Q&A, but just an outline of how European linguistics was different from our kind of linguistics in our part of the world. For us, creolization was normal. Creolization was happening all the time. It didn't create a problem in understanding. So I want to conclude with this, where this book, which came in 2011, shows that from being creolization as an exception, now creolization is becoming as the norm in disciplines. And this book was written not by linguists, but people in cultural studies and a lot of other disciplines. And what they are saying is, we have to think about all our disciplines, sociology, cultural studies, etc., as involving mixings, not to think of mixings as abnormal, but mixing as the norm and begin to study it. So one of the essay writers here, Dominique Chance, she says, maybe linguists can lead the way because they know a thing or two about Creoles, and they can help us understand how creolization works, not only in language, but in culture. And the second quotation is by some humanities scholars in the United States who feel that should also happen to our disciplinary distinctions. We should become interdisciplinary, not tie ourselves to separate disciplines, focusing on separate objects of analysis, but how culture, language, ecology, environment, objects, they all work together. And then I love this quotation because he says, all scholars should become Creoles, Creoles, meaning we should be speaking mixed languages to do good scholarship. So I want to conclude with this quotation by a Norwegian scholar you might know, you should be proud of, Einar Horgen. And he was born to Norwegian immigrants in the United States, but had considerable education in Norway. He went back and forth. I think he did his secondary schooling in Norway, came back, ended up as a distinguished professor in Harvard for linguistics. And this is from his book titled The Ecology of Language. And what he says is, he has remarkable insight before he died, soon after. The concept of language as a rigid monolithic structure is false. Even tests proved to be useful fiction in the development of linguistics. It is a kind of simplification that is necessary at a certain stage of science, but which can now be replaced by more sophisticated models. What he's saying is the idea that languages are autonomous, separate, pure, standardized, it's a simplification, it's a fiction. And basically he's chiding linguists to grow up. He says, that's a good place to start, to start doing any academic work, but you shouldn't get stuck on that, because language is much more complex. It works with ecology. It gets mixed. It's always in context. So that's a great word of wisdom from somebody Norwegian that I like. Thank you very much.